This isn't just a podcast, it's a movement. The Middle Ground Mike is fighting for truth and unity. Subscribe now or support us today. Links are in the notes. Stand with us. All right, everybody, welcome to the Middle Ground Mike. Today we've got a great guest. I've gotten to know him a little bit. Julian Baron, managing editor, I believe, if I'm correct, for Off the Press. I have checked it out. I can tell you that it, at least from my perspective, it is very balanced. They put it out there. It's, to me, it's up to you, but like I say in a lot of my episodes, trust the media just didn't collapse overnight. It's eroded one thing at a time when people can go on and they can see it. And then 5 seconds later, they see something else. And then the person that they used to trust is gone. The Walter Cronkite's of the world no longer exist. So, that's why I love having this guy here. Julian, tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. My name is Julian Baron, as you said. I am a longtime resident of the state of Maryland, grew up in Baltimore, and I'm currently the managing editor of Off the Press. I spent some time in the television news industry, and now I'm focusing almost exclusively on digital, which is what Off the Press is. We are a digital news outlet, first and foremost, and exclusively. We have our website, offthepress.com, but we also are on every social platform, that you can imagine. Twitter, the platform formerly known as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, you name it, we're there. And really what we're all about is bringing content directly to the platforms that people are engaging with and are spending their time on. And I think that, frankly, one of the situations that we have right now is a lot of legacy outlets are unwilling to engage in that space, whether it be for economic reasons or simply preference. And what we focus on is how do we get our content into the hands of people as widely as possible. That's all we care about. And so you talk about the change in the media landscape. That's what we're built for. That's what we try to be. And I appreciate the kind words about being fair. We really strive to be as fair and as neutral as we possibly can be in the way that we present the news. And so hearing you say that, we're really happy to hear that, or at least I can say I'm very happy to hear that.
Yeah, there's certain companies that I obviously won't put the others out there that I put in my bar on my browser because I'm like, okay, when I go to look up something, I try to look at multiple sources. I try to look at where's this at, where's that mind at, and I go from there, right? So when I find something that I know when I click on it, when I go to that page, I'm at least going to be able to try it. It's going to be a little bit more expansive in what it looks at. I start to trust it a little bit more. I go, okay, I know that it's not geared to push you towards one way, right? And that's where the media, that's where at least legacy media, let me rephrase it. And, that's where they went. And that's where they fell off, and that's where folks like you come in, and it's going to save media.
Well, I think one of the challenges that media has had in general is the rise of the internet. Right, because I think what the internet created was an ecosystem essentially where there's no longer limited options for news. Right, you can get your news from anywhere, and so a lot of these legacy outlets that had monopoly over news then all of a sudden had countless competitors, and everybody from the little guy to the big guy on the internet could compete legitimately with some of these larger outlets in spaces where the outlets didn't have significant followings. CNN dominated cable, NBC and ABC dominated network. You can say that legacy outlets dominated their respective platforms, but when it comes to the internet, it has really been, compared to previous iterations of news, it has been a free for all. And so I think, to your point about trust in the media, I think that what the internet has exposed is deep-seated bias in a lot of different places in the news industry. And I'm not so naive to believe that bias isn't always going to exist. I think that everybody carries personal biases. I think that story selection bias exists. I think that word choice bias exists. So I'm not going to say, oh, well, I'm unbiased or we're unbiased and we're the only ones who are unbiased, because I think that's disingenuous. I think people are smarter than that. Largely, though, what it is you have a lot of legacy media folks who exist inside of a bubble. Right? They are producing content for their newsroom. They are not producing content for their audience. They are producing content for a very small subset of America. They are not producing content for all of America. And that's what we try to do at Off the Press, is produce content for all of America so that we can appeal to people on the left, we can appeal to people on the right, and we can appeal to people in the center. and we're not particularly trying to win any of them over. We're just trying to get everybody.
Yeah, and I think that that trust that that had in the media, or that people had with the media, like 30, 40, 50 years ago, when you had the Walter Cronkites and all that of the world, the people that, like, when grandma knew she turned him on, she knew that she could trust him, and at least from my knowledge, I don't know, right? He didn't seem vindictive. He seemed like he reported what he thought, what he's seen. And I think that's what people are finding in smaller outlets like yourself. They're finding in some podcasters, right? Like, not everybody agrees with Joe Rogan, but they know the why they trust him is they know he's going to put out there what's on his mind and what he believes. And, people are going to trust more of if they feel like you're being authentic with them, they're going to trust you a little bit more than when they turn on some news stations and they go, well, I know that that's horse manure because I live this every day.
Right. And I think it's also the ultimate democratization of
Mhm.
media and content, right? Because to your point about Walter Cronkite, I think he's a great example. When our grandparents were turning on Walter Cronkite in the seas, their point of comparison was the other two anchors, right? And network television. They didn't have people on the internet that they could compare Walter Cronkite to and say, well, Walter Cronkite isn't giving it to me straight because I saw so and so on Facebook or so and so on Twitter saying XYZ, and I think that person presented the argument a lot more fairly. They didn't have that reference point. I think today you have reference points to compare the legacy media to, which people didn't used to have. And so
Right.
ultimately, what I think it's done is it's democratized media in the sense that ultimately the people that are going to give everybody the fairest shake are going to win out in the end. And I
Yes.
think that is the tough thing for a lot of legacy media to sort of fully understand is at this point, the consumer is in complete control. It used
Yeah.
to be that the networks, it used to be that the outlets were in complete control. They were the gatekeepers, right? The four television stations in town, if you were in a large market, plus the newspaper or two, had complete control over the flow of information. That no longer exists. And the power in this industry has shifted completely to the consumer. And so now it's about winning trust with consumer. It's no longer about telling the consumer what to think and how to think. It's about how do we get the consumer to trust us? And it's not about beating the station down the street. It's about beating the internet. And that's a far, far more difficult prospect.
Oh yeah, yeah. I can speak to that on as I'm sure you heard about the Campbell soup fiasco that happened a couple of months ago. That the lawsuit was filed here in Wayne County, Michigan, where I live.
I didn't know that.
And so Channel 4 had posted it, and it just at the time it wasn't super big. And I'm like, well, man, I'm like, that matters to me. I'm like, I've done a couple things on like, food dyes and a couple little things like that. So I'm like, I'm gonna do an episode on it. Next thing I know, this thing's blowing up off the charts on my show. And I'm like, and all of a sudden, people are going, hey, man, you earned a subscriber here. And I'm going, oh, okay. I'm like, this stuff matters. And then I'm like, it really does. And then that kind of led me down a rabbit hole for a couple other items that performed well. And people were like, hey, we like that you just told us what's in it and what it was about and let us decide. Because I said, like I did one per se on Lunchables, right? And something that I never really realized that there's lead in every Lunchable. I'm like, what the? I'm like, and the government says it's within the daily limit. But then when you look at the American Pediatrics Association, they say no lead is good for you, or no amount of lead is good for your body. It's terrible for you. And I'm like, but yet they allow it. And how Kraft Foods, how they got out of it is out of the lawsuit is they just pulled it from the national school lunch menu and didn't. They said we're going to work on changing it, but as of last month, I believe a University of California Consumer Reports when they tested it, still the same amount of lead in the food. And then I'm like, okay, it leads me down to another rabbit hole. A lot of your protein shakes have lead in them. Some of them have more than they even say. And I'm not, where I differ from a guy like RFK is I go, a lot of it's been there. What I have an issue with is that they acted like it wasn't there. It's like, hey, man, just be upfront about it. And that's where like the media aspect comes in, and it's like people will make a good decision, and then if you do see something like where RFK went after the petroleum dyes and he goes, hey, do the right thing and do it on your own. Don't make it where I have to come after you, whether you think the guy's crazy or not. To me, that's like, a duh moment. And some of the companies had made the right choice and did the right thing.
Well, I think ultimately what you're talking about is honesty, right? I think
Yeah.
people crave honesty, and I think when they look to a journalist or they look to a news outlet, they are expecting a clean set of facts that they can do something with, they can form an opinion with, they can make a judgment with. And I think that judgment can be positive or negative, and I think that's really ultimately where we have a fundamental challenge as an industry, because the social media algorithms are so in favor of, they prioritize content that leans a certain way, that is trying to elicit or solicit, I should say, a positive reaction or a negative reaction. And those that aren't necessarily trying to do either of those things kind of get caught up in the middle, where the algorithm doesn't really know what to do with you. So, in a way, social media actually incentivizes bad journalism. It incentivizes sensationalism. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have as an industry, right? Because I think what you're saying is 100% true. I think you talk to 99% of Americans and they'll tell you, you ask them, what are you looking for in a journalist? They want facts, they want honesty, they want transparency. And that's that, right? Those are the basic principles that they expect out of their news. The problem is they're spending 90% of their time on platforms that disincentivize that kind of behavior, right? And
Yes.
so how do you balance those two things, where to reach your audience, you have to be sensational, but to meet their expectations, you have to be factual. It's a constant balancing act. And I think it's going to be one of the generational challenges of our time, is how do you balance those two things while also trying to make money, while also trying to build a brand? Oh, it's like it's walking a
Oh, yeah.
tightrope with a stack of plates on your head over the two skyscrapers, right? That's what it is.
Oh, yeah.
But it's the beauty of the situation that we're in. It's a challenge that we must solve.
Yeah, so that, especially like the algorithm, I'd done an episode on, actually two separate ones on the Madaro, kidnapping, arrest, whatever you want to label it as. So what I did is the first 24 hours, I tested one with Madaro kidnapped question mark, and then one with Madaro kidnapped dot, period. And then I put like another part of it, because the question mark draws that what performed, boom, significantly better. Whereas the other one fell flat in its face. And I was like, and I'm like, man, I was like, okay. I'm like, to me, it's all right. And we're like, I had an issue with what major media, whatever legacy is. They were like, it's such a bad thing, but it's like, well, you're leaving out the fact that the previous president at some point probably would have done the same thing. And it's not the reasons it wasn't done, or was done, I should say, was not for what they're putting out there. They're going, hey, it's oil. Oil is a part of it, but it's also China was making a lot of deals with the oil, and it was a play to keep China out. The
Yeah.
oil is an added benefit, and nobody wanted to hear that part. And I just didn't like that they didn't put it out there. I'm like, hey, put it out there and let people decide, because I think if the public hears, hey, this is why we did it, I don't know if they would support or not support it, but you'd see less hysteria.
Let's take a quick break.
The Middle Ground, Mike, isn't just another podcast. It's a movement for unity, for truth, for a future beyond the left and the right. But movements don't grow without people willing to stand up. Subscribe now on Buzzsprout. Fuel this mission directly on PayPal. Every subscription keeps the fire burning. The links are in the show notes. Be more than a listener. Be part of the Middle Ground.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of that comes down to, personal political tendencies and beliefs. And I think, one of the challenges too of journalism, and I think it is kind of clear in what you just said too, is you can have two people look at a story and one person could say that is the fairest story they've ever read, and another person could say that's the most biased story I've ever read. Right. And so, that ultimately is kind of the challenge too, is, what bias is and what impartiality is, and all of these different things, they're all subjective.
Yes.
That is a challenge in being a deliverer of news and being a deliverer of journalism. Is there is no one clear-cut definition of what neutrality is. There is no one clear-cut definition of what fairness is. And so you have to develop your own definition based off of the principles that you have internalized and that you have developed based off of your observations and your experiences, and you say, okay, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to try to be this because I think this is as fair and as neutral as I could possibly be. Now, look, there are a lot of people out there who simply don't care about any of those principles, right? And their view is, I want to get as many views on my content as possible. And so they don't have any of those fixtures of their practices. That is not how we are at Off the Press. At Off the Press, we are all about trying to deliver content in a fair way, trying to deliver content in a way that delivers as complete of a picture to our audiences as possible, while also understanding that if we don't play the social media game, we won't reach any. And so it's again a balancing act with the understanding that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and people will always differ on what counts as biased and what doesn't.
Yeah, so from your perspective, right? Because you got obviously a lot more experience, and I'm sure that the public that is kind of just a lot of them are disengaged with media, right? Even a lot of people you see now, people are like, I'm checking out of social media for a while, right? And that's where a lot of them get their news source. They'll see, hey, I like CNN or I like this, and so when they do that, they're obviously losing track of some of the top stories. They're not hearing it as much. What beyond the traditional? I just want to be off social media for a minute. What's making people opt out of the news outside the traditional narrative?
That is such a good question. And I don't know if I have one specific answer. I think it's a combination of a lot of different things. And I think it differs from person to person, obviously. But if I had to pinpoint a few different reasons why people are looking at the news and saying, I'm not engaging with this anymore, I'm just pulling back. I think one reason is politics, right? I think people, if the political party that you don't support is in power and making headlines every single day, I think you are turned off by that. You're going to check out. So I think that's one element of it. I think another reason is because, frankly, I think people will gravitate towards sources of information that are most aligned with the way that they think. I think it's kind of human tendency. And so I think when people will turn on CNN or turn on MSNBC or turn on Fox News or any of these traditional mediums, there may not be one that aligns with the way they think. And because of that, it may cause them to shut them down. Doesn't mean that they're not going to go online and find a different source online. They often will. And that presents a whole different set of problems, because is that a reliable source? Is that somebody that can be trusted? There are a lot of different questions that come with that. But the fact of the matter is that I think is a driving force of when people feel like none of the traditional outlets are delivering information in a way that they think is accurate or fair, they're going to move away. So I think that's the second reason. And then the third reason, frankly, I think is based on the media. I think that there aren't a lot of people who sit down and watch television at the end of the day anymore, at least not the way that we used to, right? They're not watching with a cable box. They're not watching with an antenna. They're going on to Netflix and Hulu and all those streaming services. There's not a lot of people that are listening to the radio for their news. There's not a lot of people that are picking up newspapers on their way to work anymore. And so I think by virtue of all those things, there is kind of a natural attrition based off of habits where people may check out from mainstream media without even realizing that they're doing it, because they're just not engaging with the platforms where mainstream media lives. And it may just be the internet, and their algorithms may not have any mainstream media in it. And so all of a sudden you're disconnected from the mainstream media. So I would say if there were three reasons, those are the three. But of course, there are so many more, and it is so specific.
Yeah, I mean, it's, when you look at, legacy media, versus like digital, right? I don't like, what to you, what does the future, I mean, obviously we can't be specific, but what does the future look like that? Because to me, things like Off the Press, like that's going to be like, especially, as you get more bigger names in these industries, right? People are going to lean toward it. It's no different than in the 90s, there was a gajillion card companies. And then, kind of everybody weeded themselves out to a point. I think that, it'll head that way to a degree. But, I think a lot of like, I don't know if CNN's going to be around in 10 years.
Well, a lot of it comes down to the revenue model, right? So I think that you look at the revenue models for a lot of these traditional outlets, and they're going away. right? So CNN derives virtually all of its meaningful revenue from cable, right? People pay to have cable, and by virtue, they get CNN. That is, we know that cord cutting is a thing. We know that the cost of cable has changed. There is a revolution going on right now with sports where,
Mhm.
there were these regional sports networks, and now the leagues are taking control of them and they're offering direct to consumer products, especially with Major League Baseball. Sports has, in a lot of ways, from a financial perspective, propped up news on television. So
Yeah.
and these leagues start to go to streaming, direct to consumer options, the number one casualty from all of that is going to be news. And so CNN will falter as a result of that. Network television, network news will falter as a result of that. That will be the undoing a lot of these traditional outlets, is the business model. So to answer your question, I think, frankly, it's the business model that is going to be undercut from a lot of these different traditional outlets, whether they be print or television, that is going to be their undoing over the next 5 to 10 years. And so what's going to result from that, I think, are a lot of these traditional or non-traditional brands, I should say, like Off the Press, that have very low overhead. Like, we have very low overhead compared to most news outlets. We are a very small but mighty team, which means that we can sustain ourselves, at least hopefully, right, with just a little bit of cash and keep ourselves going. Whereas, CNN has a multi-million-dollar budget. They have shareholders. Well, that's a little bit of a murkier question because of the sale that's going on. But regardless, they have people they need to answer to. They need to generate revenue. They need to generate a profit. We don't have that same demand. For us, it's just, how do we stay afloat? We have a small team. Let's sustain that team and let's go. So I think you're going to see a lot of outlets like Off the Press, where very low overhead, very high output. And that's going to be the game.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and eventually the ad revenue will come, or more revenue will come as the herd thins out just a little bit. I believe, I think one of the podcast things one of the guys that I follow said that like 90% of the podcasts since COVID have all, like, they're gone. There's still a ton out there, right? But 90% fail.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh,
Yeah.
geez. But I know your time is short too. Tell the general public, right? The people listening, what's the thing that, from your perspective, that you feel that people don't know or that they need to know?
Gosh, do you mean specifically about the state of the industry?
Whatever, from your perspective on the industry, news, and just in general. Because people always love that hot take. What do you think that they need to know?
Wow, that is a really challenging question. This is going to be a little bit cliche, especially over the recent history, but I feel that it's important to say. Just because you see something on social media does not mean that it's true. And I think that we as a society are becoming incredibly reactionary, where we see something on social media, we believe it to be true, and we form opinions and we make judgments based off of that. I highly encourage everybody to do their own critical thinking and to develop, and nobody's telling anybody to go to the mainstream media, right? There's some people that have just accepted that the mainstream media is not for them. In a lot of ways, I'm one of those people, right? Because Off the Press is one of our goals, is to be outside of the mainstream. It's literally our tagline. But what I want people to remember is that just because you see something on social media doesn't mean it's true. That doesn't mean don't use social media for news. What that does mean is develop a list of brands and a list of outlets on social media that, based off of your judgment, have earned your trust. That's the
Yes.
key, right? Is being able to filter between the trustworthy and the untrustworthy. And that's a lot harder when you're using outlets like TikTok and Instagram that are curating content for you, but it's still so important. Because if you aren't filtering the content that's being delivered to you, then anything can show up in front of you and you can believe anything to be true. And that doesn't mean that you're stupid. It just means that you saw something and you trusted it. We're all trustworthy people inherently. We're all trusting people, I should say, inherently. Good people are trusting. Don't allow yourself to be manipulated by content that may have bad intentions. Focus on the outlets that have good intentions, that actually want to inform you and make you smarter. That would be my number one message to everybody.
Well, I appreciate it. Everybody, if you want some good content, want some, a balanced perspective, go to offthepress.com. Check out Julian's stuff. He's a great guy. This is the Middle Ground Mike, everybody. I thank you for tuning in. I hope everybody has a good night.
Thanks for having me.